Hello, my name is Bobby Zirkin. I'm a former state senator from Baltimore County, and I'm here with the Maryland State Bar Association, where we advocate on behalf of thousands of legal professionals across the state from many different practice areas and demographics. Over the last year, we have connected with over 20 candidates for the offices of Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, and Comptroller for nonpartisan interviews and debates. Through these conversations, the MSBA has provided an opportunity for its members and the public to hear about pressing issues facing the legal profession in the state. Today we welcome Libertarian candidates for Governor and for Lieutenant Governor, David Lashar and Christiana Logansmith, for a candidate conversation. They joined us previously for interviews, and we look forward to speaking to them again today ahead of the general election in November. To see all of our interviews with candidates, please visit msba.org/connect with the candidates. And it's great to see you two again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to just ask some questions. We're going to we have about 45 minutes to get into as many substantive issues as we can, and so I'm just going to open up the questions, and you guys are a team. You figure out who wants to answer it. So let's start with something we did not have an opportunity to talk about in the last interview. Well, first of all, before we even get there, how's it going? How's the campaign going for you guys?
It's been going really well. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges for any third-party candidate. The press doesn't want to cover you. The civic organizations have been great in including us. Money is tough to raise, of course, but you might have seen that Governor Hogan called me out, endorsed me as the most qualified candidate to succeed him as governor. So that puts some wind in our sails. When we're out across the state, we are consistently getting a positive reaction for being an alternative to the Republicans and Democrats. That's very different than my own experience in 2018, when we were hearing a third-party vote is a vote wasted. We almost never hear that this time around.
Absolutely. I am proud of how we run a true statewide campaign from Pocomoke City to Northeast to Garrett County. We've been there, we've been talking to folks, and I hear so often, I'm so glad you're doing this. Thank you. I'm delighted. I'm so happy to hear you're out there.
All right. So let's get into some substance. One of the issues we did not have an opportunity to talk about last go around was the environment. And so it's obviously a huge issue nationally, internationally, here in the state of Maryland. So let me just give you an open-ended question. If you are to succeed as being governor and lieutenant governor, some specifics as to what you think Maryland should be doing.
The key on climate is not to panic. We can't underreact, like I get the sense Dan Cox would want to underreact. We can't overreact either, like we're seeing from the Assembly and Westmore. What do I mean by that? We need to take deliberate action, but we can't just deny. We can't say we can't say no nuclear power. We can't say no low emission fossil fuels. We have to make a transition, a deliberate transition into a decarbonized future. So specifically, we need to follow through on what the Assembly did pass, right, earlier this year, the climate bill, and make sure that it is implemented competently. Right?
What does that mean?
It means, it's one thing, Bobby, as you know, to have a bill. It's another thing to have a program that is actually working and achieving its objectives. You and I worked on the Justice Reinvestment Act a handful of years ago. We need to follow through and make sure that the ideas that are in the bill are put into programs and don't have unintended consequences. If they do have unintended consequences, for example, where I would critique the bill that was passed, was the mandates around natural gas and removing natural gas from buildings in coming years. I think what we're seeing in Europe and California is that maybe that's not what we want to do. We want a diversified portfolio of energy sources, right? So I would want to, as implementing that bill, to be watching for, okay, what did the Assembly get wrong and what isn't working, and go back to the Assembly, work with them to make adjustments.
Okay.
On the Bay, the blueprint for the Bay, it's in the news this morning even, I don't know if you saw that.
I did.
The news is saying, oh, there's a crisis here. Actually, there's been tremendous progress and good news, and the report cards coming out for Maryland and Virginia are kind of B plus A minus, right? the program is meeting its goals. The problem is that Pennsylvania hasn't been doing its job, right, with runoff, especially agricultural fertilizer runoff into the Susquehanna. What would I do? I would want to work with our next Attorney General, whomever it is, work with the governor of Virginia and their AG, and apply legal pressure to Pennsylvania to meet its commitments under the blueprint.
Okay. Anything to add?
I'm obviously solidly behind that. And sometimes some of the things we can all do as Marylanders, sometimes they're the smaller things too. For instance, I was just talking to an architect who's very concerned with affordable housing. An awful lot of housing requirements are that the front of the house line up with the front of the lot line. This means you can't use passive solar. They use a lot of that in Scandinavia. Sometimes just helping to educate and make the local jurisdictions aware of these changes they can make that will have an incremental, but increments add up, change to energy use and also then affordability of housing.
Okay. I'm going to ask a specific question. I don't think and it's an environmental question as well. And you mentioned Western Maryland when we were talking beforehand. A couple years ago, and to be fair, I was somewhat involved in this issue, we banned fracking in the state of Maryland. The only state to do that by legislation. I think one may have done it through executive order, but we're the only state to have done that. Deep Creek breathed a sigh of relief because of their concern about the tourism industry and problems with the lake. Some have said that we went too far. Thoughts on fracking in the state of Maryland?
Yeah, I think that because fracking, the externalities of that practice are not well understood, that was not the wrong bill, right? I think that what we should do with the fracking is keep an eye on the pros versus cons of that approach. But we libertarians are always very focused on externalities of anybody's behavior, like I was just talking about with Pennsylvania runoff, right? There's no reason that we in Maryland and Virginia should be bearing those costs. There's no reason that watermen on the Chesapeake should be losing their jobs and their livelihoods because of the runoff from the Pennsylvania farms. Same with fracking. We just need to understand what the implications are. I'm comfortable with the policy that we have in place.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on. Governor Hogan, who you mentioned before, leaves office with, if you believe polls, maybe the highest popularity of any governor leaving office, at least in recent memory. So I guess my question for you is an open-ended one again, which is, legislatively, you mentioned the Justice Reinvestment Act, which I think was a big one. In addition to the Justice Reinvestment Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit, what is it that you attribute his high popularity to? And I don't just mean that he's a good guy and relatable and so forth, but actually from a legislative standpoint, what did he get right in these last 8 years that you think, maybe could be built on, but kind of his best legislative achievement, in your opinion?
His best legislative achievement was holding the line on taxes. Frankly, I give Governor Hogan a B minus for his overall job. The reason that his popularity is so high in my estimation is that he didn't use his popularity to take stands of principle on tough legislative issues. He didn't really engage the legislature in tough battles. He conserved his political capital. I think that was a mistake. If as governor, I would use the political capital I have to try to get things done or advance ideas to the legislature, even if I didn't think the ideas were going to turn into law this session. Right? You have to have a long game. So Governor Hogan, the way he handled the riots, I think that he protected life and property. The way he overcame cancer, I think contributed much to his popularity. But what did he do in his second term? He turned his attention to running for president in 2024, and that was a bit of a disappointment to me.
So, but let's turn then to the Justice Reinvestment Act, which I think was in my career, I don't think I ever saw a bill as big or as meaningful as that, and he was the leader of that issue. So I guess let's turn right to the specifics of the issue. The biggest criminal justice reform in the history of the country, certainly in Maryland, and makes what the federal government did look like nothing. And so, and I know you're intimately involved. We're intimately involved in that. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? And what's kind of the next steps of the Justice Reinvestment Act if you're elected governor?
It was a generational milestone as a bill, right? And the Assembly deserves credit, and Governor Hogan deserves credit. What we got right was that Governor Hogan did make sure to follow through on making programs that realized the goals that were in the legislation. You mentioned my intimate involvement. You may remember that my involvement was that in the first 6-9 months of trying to implement that bill, the Hogan administration was sputtering. We tried a couple quarterbacks. Those quarterbacks couldn't work across the executive agencies. They weren't working well with the legislature. The Secretary of the Department of Health called me in to be the new quarterback, and that's when I started working with you, the courts, the agencies like Human Services, to very importantly, public safety and correctional services, right? And within 90 days, we went from having court-ordered services for mental health or substance use disorders. We got from 60 to 120 days from the court order to the services being delivered, took that down to 15 to 25 days, right? So I think what was done right.
As required by the law.
I'll go further than that, right? As required by constitutional and human rights. I don't think you would disagree with that.
I would not.
So that was good. I don't know that there were really any gaps left for that bill. But what we need to do is ask what's next. And
what is next?
Yeah, and so on criminal justice, there are several steps that need to be taken. I think that Wes Moore would agree with me on this, which is day one in office, I would want to undertake a review of nonviolent criminals who are incarcerated to see if there's an opportunity for return to the community, amnesty and return to the community. I think that for ongoing change, I think we need to look at the Public Defender's Office. I think the Public Defender's Office is underfunded relative to the Prosecutor's Office for sure. Not enough support staff for the attorneys who work there. I think that we need more transparency of the judges themselves on their decisions. When I, this summer, had the opportunity to talk to somebody, sit down with her, how does the Baltimore County Public Defender's Office work, and what are your challenges? And one of the challenges that she mentioned is that she goes in and she doesn't necessarily know the rulings of judges, right? The patterns of judges on certain types of cases, so she can't mount as good a defense or negotiation, right, as she might otherwise want to do. Otherwise, on criminal justice, I think we need to look at qualified immunity, not abolish it, because if you abolish qualified immunity, which you would know, right, but maybe the audience doesn't know, it protects public officials from accountability for police officers. Police officers in particular, as I understand it, others as well, but police officers is what we're talking about here, from egregious violations of rights of individuals.
Let me ask you a question about that. We didn't get into that at all. It's a complicated issue, and I guess my question is, so let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. When you say you wouldn't abolish it, like the law, what would you change about that law? Because there are questions about how, there are some candidates, at least in the primary, who were talking about abolishing qualified immunity, but there are some serious questions about how that would work in practice. What is your position on qualified immunity for public safety officers?
That we need to find the right calibration, which is not going to be easy to find, right? Because if you abolish qualified immunity, like many of our fellow libertarians want to do, then you're not going to get what you need in law enforcement, which is good people serving, right? That's the problem. But when there are egregious violations of civil rights, there does need to be, the police officers do need to be accountable for what they do. I don't remember the name of the incident. It was on the Eastern Shore about a handful of years ago, right? Where a young man was much like George Floyd, he was choked to death, right, on the Eastern Shore. There needs to be more accountability amongst law enforcement for those kinds of incidents.
Can I ask you a question? I don't mean to interrupt, because I truly don't understand. I mean, I understand the theory of it, but qualified immunity just simply says that you can't civilly go after the individual. So if that were to happen, if they were to abolish qualified immunity, and police officers would need insurance, would essentially need liability insurance for themselves, because it's not just going to be the one you're talking about, it's going to be a lot of other lawsuits as well. A police officer making, and I ask you this because I know the libertarian position is to do that, I just don't understand how it works in practice. An OBGYN in Baltimore City, for example, pays, high six figures for their liability insurance. I would assume in places like Garrett County it would be lower, but in Baltimore City, a police officer, it would, I don't even know if the liability insurance actually exists. And so, but if it did, it would be exorbitantly expensive, probably more than they make as a salary. How does that work in practice? And wouldn't it be a better position just to simply go after the jurisdiction as we do now?
The way it would work is for the insurance is that the local community would need to provide that kind of insurance.
So the local jurisdiction would have to pay for the insurance for the officer?
For the reasons, because otherwise, again, they won't be able to get good people in law enforcement, right? So OBGYN, as your example, doctors, they bake the cost of that insurance into their services. Rather than having the individual police officers carry the insurance, it would have to be the jurisdiction. And
so I'm going to get you in trouble with the local jurisdictions now.
Okay.
I assume you haven't costed that one out, but let me ask you this. If you did something like that, wouldn't it just be simpler to say that you can just sue, a Baltimore City officer, if there's a lawsuit, as you do now, you'll sue the local jurisdiction, you'll sue Baltimore City, and if it's within the scope of practice, you go after them, but there's a liability cap. Would you then say, you know what, you don't need to take that to federal court. You can go after Baltimore City for that, and there would be no kind of local tort claims act cap.
What we need to do, what we have right now is not working. How do we know that it's not working? It's because there is no trust between the community and law enforcement, right? The time that I've been spending in Baltimore City itself, people actually do want the law enforced, right? They do want the rule of law, but the police officers, law enforcement, is not feeling the support of the state's attorney and the community. That restoration of trust needs to occur, and in my view, a reform of qualified immunity would put us in that direction.
All right, you've become a good politician, so I'm going to move you right back to my question, though. Local Tort Claims Act. Should Maryland, because a couple of years ago, I think you were there, or you were in the executive branch, administration, did in fact raise the Tort Claims Act, which hadn't been touched forever. This is the Maryland State Bar Association. Do you think that Maryland, with the state and local Tort Claims Acts, with the caps that we have, are we in the sweet spot, or do we need to adjust it again?
I don't know if we're in the sweet spot, but to get in the sweet spot, it ends up costing a little bit more. I think that is a cost worth bearing for the goal.
Okay. Let's move on. Juvenile justice. And again, I'm asking you both these questions, and you guys.
This is appropriate.
Okay. All right. Juvenile justice is not an issue that you often will hear about on a campaign trail because it's just not that sexy. But it's incredibly important, in my opinion at least, and the opinion of many attorneys who work in the field. In a former life, I was the chair of the Juvenile Law Subcommittee when I was in the House. Complicated issue, kids getting in trouble. And when I want to focus on when they're in the system, not before they get in the system, but actually when they're in the system. You have detention facilities, commitment facilities, issues about wraparound community services. Open-ended question, where does Maryland fall short in juvenile justice, and where do you think we need to take the juvenile justice system, as it is such an important public safety issue?
Yeah, let's talk about in the system what I've seen, and what I saw was from my perch at the Department of Health, Bobby, right? And then the broader question of what do we need to do to prevent fewer youth getting into the system? That's what we really need to do, right? Behavioral health is what I saw from my perch as an area that we need to improve in. Right? And it is coordination of the different kinds of supports and services that are available to youth. Breaking down the barrier, breaking down, it's not barriers, it's the disincentives for agencies in the executive branch to work together that are the problem. I saw them firsthand. They're not easy to break down, right? But you can do so. And you have to ask each one of the agencies, you have to go in and look at how they are incented and say, with their programs, their money, why aren't they incented to bring in more behavioral health services at an earlier point in time? Getting behavioral health supports and services, whether it's juvenile justice or just primary care writ large in the state, is something that we need to do, because the earlier you get those behavioral health services and supports into the delivery of services to the patient, the more effective they're going to be and the lower cost they're going to be over time. So for juvenile justice, it's integrated services and an emphasis on behavioral health from what I saw from the Department of Health. The larger question is, how do we create a society, an environment in which fewer kids are slipping into the system? Right. And that is not a one solution is going to fix the problem. Anybody who says that is not being realistic.
Right.
And, better schools is part of it. Reinforcing family is part of it, and supporting family.
Support the blueprint?
So
I didn't mean to interrupt you. We can get on that afterwards.
let's return to that.
We'll
okay.
Return to that.
Put it in the parking lot on the side. But the other thing is that we need to restore safety on the streets. And I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with a 77-year-old gentleman in West Baltimore, Harlem Park. And he was talking about when he grew up in Harlem Park in the 20s, 30s, maybe it was. And was there racism? Yes. There was outright discrimination, right? But he was fond of his recollection on the streets because he felt safe. He wasn't hungry. There was a fabric to society of not only his own family, but the community and even law enforcement. He was talking about how he still remembered the name of the officer who had the beat on his block, right? So law enforcement, community-based policing is what we need to get back to on that. But it's fixing the schools, creating safe streets. How do we do that today in 2022? This is where we have to look at what's causing the crime and the violence. And I don't think that my rivals, Westmore or Dan Cox, is getting to the root causes. The root cause, and you've heard me talk about this, is that we have a prohibition of narcotics that is creating a black market that has allowed gangsters and traffickers to run the streets in the city of Baltimore. Until we face that root cause problem and take action against it, these problems are going to persist.
And by taking action against that root cause of drugs, the Libertarian position is to legalize?
My position is to legalize
all drugs?
Even narcotics, making them available not in open-air markets, like the Tenderloin District of San Francisco shows that model does not work. We need to look more towards Netherlands and Portugal, where you can, if you are trapped in the hell of addiction and your body craves these chemicals, these substances, you can go to a dispensary like we currently have for medical cannabis. And you can get the substances that your body craves. You can do so safely. You can receive supports and services. There can be what's called an intervention, if you're willing to take that. And what we can do through this model is eliminate the black market.
So here's my question on that. I think we talked a little bit about that last time. That's Delegate Morheim's bill that he put in forever, my former delegate. And then Senator Feldman after that. I guess my question on that is, first of all, I guess, what would you do, the kind of a specific question is, well, what do you do outside of the walls of that essentially government-run facility? Like outside the walls, if somebody possesses heroin, if somebody possesses, or somebody decides not to kind of take the bait there and decides to go sell drugs anyway because it's lower cost, or they're just doing it easier for them to get it in the neighborhood rather than the government-run facility. Is that decriminalized or legalized as well?
Well, the model that I'm describing is that going out and shooting up or lighting up on the street is not condoned. Right?
Is it legal?
It is discouraged, and you would get a fine.
So it'd be a civil.
There you go. You're the lawyer.
So the question, so I just want to make sure I understand exactly what we're talking about. So if somebody is on their stoop shooting heroin, a police officer could walk up and give them a ticket. Because that's what you essentially can do now for marijuana under a certain amount. It's a civil fine.
It's a civil fine to try to change behaviors, to say this is what the community accepts, this is what the community doesn't accept, but not creating this vast difference that we have today. This gap between the only choice is, you're doing it, or we're going to throw you in hard jail, right? It's allowing law enforcement and the community to respond to the behaviors on the street. Say, this isn't acceptable. You need to either go into a private residence or what's called a harm reduction center. This is something to make available. That is an environment in which individuals can go to take the drug, shoot up, but they will not be pursued by law enforcement, and it's another environment in which they can receive supports and services.
I guess one of my questions, not to drill too much because this is a long topic conversation.
Yes, it is.
And I want to get to some other ones today before we're done. But if you don't have any stick over somebody, some number, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's not insignificant, of individuals who end up in treatment facilities get there and do well there because they're facing jail time, they're facing a penalty, and so that becomes the avenue for getting them into a treatment. They wouldn't have sought treatment just because somebody suggested it or somebody really suggested it. They got there because they were facing a significant penalty, and that was the stick that said, you know what, you've got to get to Gaudenzi or Right Turn, wherever, in order to get into treatment. And so and this is the conversation I always have with Delegate Moorheim, how do you get them there other than strongly suggest it to them? Like, aren't you losing a lot of people who would go into a facility because of the stick that's being held over their head?
We can't save everybody. So we have to be realistic about what we're trying to achieve and what we're not going to be able to achieve. Remember, the question on the table was, what do we do about too many kids getting into the criminal justice system, right? There's only so much we can do once they're in the criminal justice system. I don't want them to get there in the first place. And so to say, like Wes Moore says, that all we need is more gun control and that's going to address the crime and make the streets of Baltimore safe, not just safer, but more hopeful, that's wrong. To say what Dan Cox says, that all we need to do is hire more cops and threaten more jail time, that's not going to work either. The root cause is the black market in the narcotics. That's what we have to address. And what I'm trying to do is open up this kind of discussion to figure out how might that work and get us to a better place. That's what I want to do as governor.
Okay. You want to jump in on this one?
So,
Please.
Two things that sold me on the legalization approach. Number one, I'm a mom. As my son was growing up, classmates of his in Annapolis were getting threatened, getting shot in the housing projects. During the Prohibition, Al Capone, gun battles. When's the last time we had a gun battle where innocent bystanders got killed or anybody got killed over a truck full of whiskey? It doesn't happen. Are we suddenly going to have utopia? Nobody's going to suffer from addiction. No kids are going to go hungry because mom's passed out from heroin on the couch. If we legalize it, I'm afraid that won't cure that. But it will significantly reduce the incentive for young people to get drawn into that world and the violence.
So let me ask you then. I moved away from it. I find this is an intriguing conversation and discussion. What if you're selling, right? And I understand the concept is to try to avoid that, but if and when that doesn't work, and somebody's selling drugs and they're selling it, and you're possessing a truckload of cocaine or heroin or what have you, right? If all of a sudden it's a civil offense, how is it that you deal with the kingpins, the significant drug dealers who continue to prey on the street? Because I'm not sure that everybody's going to make their way to a government center to do drugs. Like how do you deal with all possession with intent to distribute, distribution, kingpins? I mean, significant amount of law. What do you do with them?
So you remove the black market, the kingpins go away. That's who you're striking
And you're
at.
saying you're going to remove the entire black market?
If you're not removing the black market, you're not achieving the policy objective, right? And you're not making any social impact. You have to destroy the incentives that make it a good business for the gangsters and traffickers to do what they do.
Do you make the drugs free for individuals who are coming into the harm reduction centers?
Free, low cost, something. If you don't do that, then how do you make progress?
Where do you get it?
But here's what you need to do. Let's talk cannabis, right? Cannabis. California has legalized cannabis and shown us what not to do here in Maryland. It's a foregone conclusion that the ballot initiative here is going to pass. We are going to have legalized recreational cannabis here in Maryland. What nobody's talking about is what after that. And the key to what after that is not to put such high taxes on the now legal cannabis that the black market, for cannabis anyway, stays in place. That's what California did. And so what they ended up doing is having the worst of all worlds. They still had their black market for the cannabis, right? And they were getting the legal channels were still selling and available, but nothing really changed.
With cannabis, just move into that a little bit, with assuming that the referendum passes, which seems like a safe bet at this point in time. One of the issues, I mean, they haven't really done any of the details of it, so it's not quite there yet. Even if the referendum passes, that doesn't necessarily like all of a sudden just open it up. They still have to figure out all the details of distribution and who gets to sell it and who gets to grow it. I mean, that's very complex. But one of the issues that's less complex, but it's still quite controversial, is where you can use it, where you can smoke it, right? So I guess, do you think, it was a fierce debate for years, even with decriminalization with medical, is that you walking down the beach or in a park or in a playground with your 5-year-old, not something that necessarily people, I don't have any problem with somebody going into their own home and doing it, but if you're sitting out there at the beach and they're blowing smoke in my kid's face, that doesn't necessarily sit too well even for those who are in favor of it. Where do you fall on that? Smoking in public? And I guess as a corollary question to that, I'm in an apartment building, right? I rent an apartment, and somebody below me is smoking away in their own house, but it's coming up to my house, it's coming up to my apartment every day. I can't live there, right?
Yeah.
How do you fall on these issues?
Well, it sounds like on the parks and in the public spaces, it sounds like I fall where you fall. I mentioned Portugal and Netherlands. The reason I did so is because legalizing doesn't mean condoning and encouraging, right? So lighting up your blunt on the street at the park, no, that's putting you at risk of the civil fines that I was talking about, right? Discourage, push it to private use. You raised another case, right, which is your apartment building or your condo. That is up to the residents and ownership management of that condo, right? I mean, we got to let people do what they want to do
At the same time, these are not crazy new problems we'd have to deal with. We already have tobacco and alcohol. In Maryland, you are not allowed to drink public drinking at the playground, not allowed to do it. And I presume, I certainly know that if I'm not a smoker, if I rented an apartment and the person below me was smoking so much nicotine and it was coming up and my apartment smelled like smoke, I would be just as quick to take action on that as I would if it was cannabis. And so we're already dealing with these issues. Maybe you're familiar with how the code treats tobacco smoking in an apartment building.
Right. So you're essentially saying that you're going to treat cannabis the same so a private residence could ban it, an apartment building could still ban it.
Absolutely.
Out in public, it
Yeah.
should still be banned.
Yeah, I mean, I think between alcohol and tobacco, and in some ways for the public use, I would consider that it falls in the same thing. And maybe down the line we want to adjust our laws on some of those others, but it's not like this something coming from Mars.
Gotcha.
We're prepared. Our system's prepared and has the precedence to deal with a lot of these situations.
Okay, let's move on to another one. Don't have so much time. So one of the big ticket items of the Justice Reinvestment Act was expungement. And expungement is now a pretty hot topic in the General Assembly, with lots of pieces of legislation about specific crimes that should or should not be expungible. Nobody's gone as far to say that everything should be expungible, but curious your thoughts. There was about 100 or so so-called nonviolent offenses that were allowed to be expunged in the Justice Reinvestment Act. Thoughts on, did we go far enough? Is there more to do? And if there is more to do, where is there more to go to?
Not read up and up to speed on all 100 bills, right? But as a general principle, favorable towards fairly liberal expungement rules. Right? For nonviolent crimes, probably after some kind of probation period, right? Somebody demonstrate that they've changed their ways and aren't a threat. But expungement is something that Christiana and I would be very favorable towards.
Are there any specific things that you think that we should be? I mean, it is of course challenging to figure out what's a quote. That's why I said quote nonviolent crimes, because theft doesn't hurt somebody physically, but it certainly hurts somebody with their business and so forth. Where do you fall? Like, it's just a tricky little area, gray area.
The key here is, what's the difference between a Lashar Logansmith administration addressing an issue like this versus Cox Schiafinelli versus Moore Miller? What's the difference? The difference is that on some of these nuances, and there's always nuances, this issue or any other, we're not dug in somewhere. We're not beholden to some Democratic Party machine, some Republican MAGA set of doctrine. We can have these productive conversations with the General Assembly that has the Democratic supermajority that's going to stay in place to push back on the worst excesses or impulses of the Assembly, but I'm going to say keep a more open mind than what we would get or expect from a Cox MAGA type of mindset.
So for instance, you talk about the idea of expungement. Let's go back to the principle. We have criminal records because we think there are circumstances under which past behavior, people, whether it's an employer or a apartment building, a landlord again, might deserve to know. And I'm sure there's plenty of data out there. If we look at things, there's some crimes that you say, okay, after this period of time, once again, that probation, if somebody hasn't repeated it, they're unlikely to. So let's expunge that. That doesn't need to stick around. So once again, we're pragmatic. What's the purpose that's serving? And at what point, when somebody's served their sentence, shown that they're not repeating this behavior, should they no longer be burdened by that? Have they earned a clean record?
Okay. I'm getting the 5-minute high sign, so let's do a little bit of rapid fire here. I know you wanted to talk. Yeah, I know you wanted to talk about election reform, something that's of interest to you. So, the floor is yours for about 30 seconds now. What is it? What is it that your administration, if you're elected, would be interested in doing in terms of elections?
One general thing, one specific thing, given the time limit. Right? Generally, where we are in American politics right now, whether you are on the left of the spectrum or the right of the spectrum, if you accept the spectrum, there has been a loss of faith in the electoral process. right? Whether it's access or integrity of the elections, we need to restore trust. And I don't think that our Maryland system is in a very bad way, but I think that we need to bring together people and say what can be done so that we have high access and high integrity. Right? So I want to personally lead a commission to bring people together, increase ballot access, not just for individuals, but for parties, third parties. And in particular, this is the specific issue I wanted to bring up. A way of changing the voting system so that we can expect structurally to get a different kind of outcome than we have today. It's ranked choice voting. I don't know how many people in the audience have even heard of ranked choice voting, but it's a change from what we have in the following respect. Instead of voters going in and voting for one and only one candidate for every office, voters go into the booth and they get to rank all of the candidates for every office. So there's 5 candidates for governor. If you like David Lashar best, you would put him first, then Westmore, then whomever, right? What this ranked choice voting system does is 2 things. One, it applies a penalty for those who are extremists in politics. We've seen this in Maine, we've seen this in Alaska that have already adopted the system. And 2, it creates not just an incentive, but a necessity for the media to cover not just the Republicans and Democrats like they're doing here in Maryland for this cycle, but to cover all of the candidates who are duly on the ballot, because voters are going to walk in and express an opinion for everybody that's on the ballot. So I think for a more vibrant democracy that's surfacing more voices and ideas for a better future, ranked choice voting is something we need to look at.
In the experience, in kind of your understanding of it, is there any danger of extremist parties, like extremist third parties, getting, not that the Libertarian, I'm not calling your party an extreme, but like somebody runs and they're, anti-Semitic or racist, like kind of really extremist parties. Is there a risk that kind of you run in getting those individuals because, maybe a Democrat or a Republican would never vote for a Democrat, so they go Republican and then the next one, and then kind of you have the ability of getting, super extremists, or is that not a concern?
It's not a zero risk. Right? But I think what we have to do is something that I don't see enough in American political conversations amongst elites, which is we have to trust the voters. And we have to talk not just about voting rights, but voting responsibilities. And voters need to be well enough informed to say, if there was some awful party, right? The awful party, that in the rank, maybe they get on the ballot, but everybody puts them, if it's five candidates, number 5. That's a responsibility of the electorate.
Okay. So I have gotten the 5-minute, I've gotten the zero high sign now. So let me ask you this. I wanted to talk about guns and economic development and taxes and all kinds of other issues, civil justice and other issues. Just end by saying, why don't you just tell us where people can go and your website to see where people can learn more about your ticket.
Yeah, we've tried to do a good job of expressing all of our ideas. So davidlashar.com, that's Lashar with an AR. And if you go to the website, there's an issues and ideas page. There's also a learn more posting on the blog. And those resources will get you to enable you to learn more about us.
Absolutely. And when you go to the polls on election day, having done your research, your vote does count. Which column you choose to make the check mark in is your record. Vote your principles. If our platform is what appeals to you, I hope you'll stand in our column because your vote will be noticed.
All right. David Lashar, Christiana Logansmith, thank you so much for being here again on behalf of the tens of thousands of members of the Maryland State Bar Association. This is your second interview and a couple weeks to go before the election. I just want to, on behalf of MSBA, say thank you so much for taking time to be with us here today.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Bob.
Sure.